All right. Hi, everyone. So I am going to be presenting on what I've been working on throughout the semester for my project. And it is basically the economic factors affecting solar production in Caribbean islands. So just a little bit of an agenda of what I'm going to be covering. So first, I'm going to go into the intro. So just general background information on why I chose the topic and what my research goal was and data sources. And then we go through the EDA stuff, then modeling, then going through the results and the conclusions, and then finally opening for questions for anything that is presented. Okay, so basically my overall PhD dissertation is surrounding finding or implementing a systematic approach to fund allocation in developing countries, and more specifically in Caribbean countries, being that I grew up in the Caribbean myself, and just trying to figure out what ways we can best, allocate funds to prepare for and respond to natural disasters, given the other limiting factors surrounding developing countries. So the reason I picked this particular topic is because I hypothesized that renewable energy, and more specifically solar energy, when compared to other sources like wind or thermal, solar in general, based on my research, was kind of the most popular among the Caribbean islands, and also kind of for obvious reasons. It's close to the equator, lower startup costs compared to wind. But that was the reason I kind of honed in on solar production. And I thought that it would be a good indicator of how resilient an island's energy system may be. But I also thought that the economic factors that affected solar production could also be a little bit transferable to other renewable energy productions, but also just general fund allocation. Being that it's an economic issue, I figure that economic factors affecting the renewable energy portion of it could probably also be transferable or be affecting other areas of fund allocation, and would be something to look into there. So that's kind of the main reason I picked this particular topic to dive into. So the factors that I ended up going with to kind of test my theory based on my lit review that we performed was gross domestic products, or GDP, foreign direct investment. So let me back up. GDP essentially, I think everybody's kind of familiar with it. It's just essentially how much money the country is, I wouldn't say worth, but how much it's putting out, or that it's. So of course, more developed countries are going to have higher GDPs versus the more developing countries. Foreign direct investment, on the other hand, is essentially private investment or even federal investment from other countries into another country. So it could be, for example, a private entity investing money into Jamaica, for example. Let's say that Walmart, which isn't the case, let's say that Walmart starts investing in Walmart in Jamaica. That'd be an example of foreign direct investment. It's kind of expanding private or public entities into other islands. And then official development assistance is, for example, after Haiti's earthquake, a lot of ODA porting. So that's just money that other countries give. For example, now the US is giving a lot of money to help with efforts in Ukraine. So that's just money that other countries give to help out. So I picked those three factors to compare in all the stuff I'm going to show after this. So the countries I ended up picking, because the Caribbean is made up of a bunch of tiny islands or smaller islands that don't necessarily have a lot of data, my approach was to pick kind of the five biggest or most popular in a sense. And those are Jamaica, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Haiti, Trinidad and Tobago, and the Dominican Republic. And in order to increase my data points, I ended up analyzing the data from 2014 to 2019. And I stopped in 2019 because in 2020 was the pandemic and there just wasn't a lot of data being reported. As with everything else, that kind of got messed up with the pandemic as well. And I would like to start with a very big disclaimer before I go into the EDA stuff, is that there is, even with picking these five countries that have the most data, it was still extremely gappy in data. So there's a lot of missing values for different countries, for the different predictor variables. So it was very difficult working around that in the project. And because of that, it made it super difficult to even generalize any of my findings. So just keep that in mind as we go through. Okay, so let's go through EDA. So First, I tidied the data. As you can see, I just put little clips of code here. So on the left, I gave the example of how I tidied the data for foreign direct investment. So out of the data set that I had, it kind of had foreign direct investments for all the countries or from the, by the way, I got my data from the United Nations database. I forgot to mention that in the introduction, but all the data sets came from the United Nations database. But when they have it listed, they list all the countries that they have, and they have different years, I think going back from like the 70s all the way up to present. So I pulled out the country name, the different dates that I wanted, and I organized it into a table and indexed it so that it'd be easier to filter it out, the different countries that I wanted. And as you can see, kind of change country name to country just to make it consistent across all the predictor variables and the outcome variable as well. So you can see the table that comes out after that. And I basically repeated a similar process for all the other variables. Then to the right, you can see where I put it all together. So I did two at a time. So I used full join to add GDP to solar and basically did that until I got my complete data set that I call data complete. And you can kind of see a small chunk of that in the table of what that looks like. And as you can see already, you can see by the NAs that Cuba in particular had quite a bit of missing data for 2 out of the 3 predictor variables. So that just became very difficult as we started modeling and everything else. Of course, wrote and saved the data. So that's just kind of a summary of how it was tidied. And then we looked at the data summary story. So because as you can see so the first thing I kind of highlight is solar production. That's the main one that stood out to me. So you can see here the min is 1, but the max is 2255, and the units is million kilowatt hours. So there's a pretty huge gap between how much the 5 countries or between the 5 countries of between the least to the greatest. It's a pretty big range of solar production. GDP was the most consistent. I'd say it only varied by 1 degree, as you can see on the GDP column. So the GDPs were fairly close among all countries, even though the solar production was had a super wide range. And then FDI was another one that stood out to me because, as you can see, the minimum for FDI is negative, and what that basically means is that there's more net outflow out of the country. Investment wise, so it could mean that this country, for example, it could mean that companies are disinvesting or that this company is reinvesting itself outside of the country. So their net outflow was greater, and that particular country was actually Trinidad and Tobago for one of the years. So that's what the data summary looked like. Then I looked at the correlation and the p-value. So based on the data that you're seeing here on the tables, I can use my mouse. So you can see that GDP here, GDP and FDI had kind of the largest, or I guess the highest positive correlations, and they're still not, super high. It's 0.75 and 0.79 respectfully. So you can see that here with the solar production down here. So 0.79 for GDP, 0.75 for FDI, and ODI isn't on there. ODA, I should say, isn't on there, but it was smaller than these two. I kind of just cut so you can see these two. And then looking at the p-value up here, if we're supposed to use an alpha of 0.05, GDP would be very small with the 0.008. And then also, FDI had 0.08 and GDP had 0.002. So kind of going in, I thought those would be the variables that had the most effect on solar production. But as you can see that here and here for reference. But of course, with a small amount of data sets, it's very hard to generalize that to a bigger population. So just keeping that in mind. So then we went on to the univariate analyses. And as you can see, even prior to these are showing so I used GDP on the right to kind of show what it looked like before a log transformation and after a log transformation. And whereas I used FDI and solar production after the log transformation. In retrospect, it looked pretty bad before the log transformation, a little bit better after, but Maybe another transformation would be better on GDP in particular, but for the other two, they were very skewed before they underwent the log transformation. So I figured they'd help, but honestly, again, I don't know how much the transformation would have helped, given that it just wasn't a lot of observations and data points. So I don't, they weren't super accurate as far as the transformations helping out very much. So again, one of the many issues that came with not having enough data. Same here with the multivariate analyses, not super accurate trends because of the wide range. For example, in solar production, you're not even sure if that's as you can see, Dominican Republic and Cuba, even Puerto Rico are pretty high comparatively. So you can't really necessarily tell the trends over the years. Sometimes there's just a big uptick, but in general, it looked like it was increasing over the years. And same thing for GDP, and then ODA just honestly was up, seemed pretty straight across. So not much to be drawn from there. Did the same thing with a scatter plot. Just tried to color code it per country. Again, not having a lot of data points, it's super hard to draw any particular conclusions. The one that kind of gave the most information was the solar production, which it looked like in general for most countries over the years, it seemed like it was going up, except for maybe Trinidad and Tobago and Haiti. But for the other countries, it seemed like it was kind of consistently increasing. GDP was, no particular pattern here. And then same thing with foreign direct investment, not necessarily a particular pattern existing there either. All right, so jumping to modeling. So what I did was I compared complete pooling to no pooling, but before I did the complete pooling, I tested it with a log transformation of only solar production, because doing the univariate analysis, solar production became the most uniform after the log transformation. So I wanted to test it with a log transformation of only solar, as you can see here. And then on the next slide, I show you with the log transformation on the other variables. So here, as you can see, the residual error was 0.6145, but due to missing data, there's 20 observations missing. So I think there was 36 data points total, but with 20 missing, that's only 16 viable data points. So even though you can compare with it, it's still not the best with this many missing observations, and it was kind of difficult to work around it. So that's what I listed here on the side. So I'm going to show you the other one now. So when I did the log transformation, I ended up only doing a log transformation of ODA because foreign direct investment and GDP had the most missing data. So I tried to reduce the amount of missing observations. So it still didn't even help much because there were still 14 missing. So I only did a log transformation on ODA. And as you can see here, the residual standard error jumped up to 1.503. So of the two complete pooling models, the one with just a log transformation on solar production was the better of the two. And then figuring that out, when I did so as you can see here, I wanted to show you with no log transformation that RSC jumps up to 50.9. So obviously that's kind of the worst of all the models. So I think solar production definitely needed a log transformation. Then after that, I did no pooling and I used year as a factor. So I did the no pooling with only a log transformation on solar production. And as you can see here, the RSC drops down to 0.437 compared to 0.6145. And when I did it with the log transformation on all the variables, it was slightly higher with 0.475. So overall, the best model of all the ones I tested was no pooling model with only a log transformation on the outcome variable, which is solar production, going based off the RSCs. So after going through that, I compared the no pooling model with log transformation on only the solar version. I compared that to the complete pooling model with only a log transformation on the outcome variable. And so looking at R squared, the higher is better, and you can see the no pooling had a slightly higher value in R squared. And then looking at the log likelihood and the AIC, lower is better. And as you can see in both cases, a no pooling model kind of edged out over the complete pooling model. And this is just, I basically said that down here in the comments, that of the two models looking at these fit metrics, the no pooling model is still the better model. And then with the QQ plots, it becomes very obvious that there aren't a lot of data points, but even with a few data points, the no pooling models still look the best as far as the points fitting between the shaded area. So based on the using QQ plots as well, you can see that the no pooling model was still the better model. Not much necessarily to be drawn from the residuals, repeating the same thing over and over, just not a lot of data points. So they look, I guess you could say the no pooling model looks slightly better, but again, they're pretty close. I wouldn't even use that as a deciding factor. Same thing with the backcasting plot. If you're being nitpicky, the no pooling model does look like the points are a little, closer to the line, or in a sense, but I also didn't feel like that was the backcasting plot was a good indicator of kind of showing which one is better than the other. Then we got to the k-fold cross-validation, and I used 3 folds because of the small sample size, but with a very, very small sample size, I'm not even sure if that was, if that even made a difference because of the sample size being so small. And then because of that too, the means that we got were so much higher than those of the original means for both the models. So I don't think the k-fold did much in kind of model selection here either. Oh, sorry. And then finally, coming to the final conclusions, the biggest one, as I mentioned before, is that the sample size was just simply too small. Focusing on the Caribbean islands really limited the number of observations, but from a more general standpoint, I think this is just an indication that more primary research and data collection needs to be done in this region because there just isn't a lot of data out there. And then also the no pooling model with log transformation of the outcome variable, which is solar production, was the best model overall based on the residual mean squared error, the fit metrics, and the QQ plot. But like I mentioned before, the residuals and the k-fold cross-validation really didn't do too much as kind of being a deciding factor as to which one was better. Transformations may still need to be done on the predictor variables. So based on the univariate analyses, like I said, they still weren't as uniform as I'd like them to be. But with such small data points, I'm not sure if another transformation outside of log would have been better, or if you would have even been able to tell, or if I'd still need more data points to kind of get a good image. And then finally, GDP and foreign direct investment seem to be the predictors that would have the most impact on solar production. So my general takeaways from that is that disaster preparedness and just energy is really an economic issue, and it seems like countries with better economies, so if they have a higher GDP or private entities are investing more in them, they're usually the ones that are more likely to invest in renewable energy and other areas that could increase disaster preparedness and response. That is my presentation, and I think I went over 10 minutes, but if anybody has any questions, please let me know.